"You really wore that to my daughter's graduation dinner?" my daughter-in-law said, loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. She looked me up and down like I was something she'd stepped in on the way inside. I mean, it's fine. For a handyman, I guess. I was wearing my best shirt, the blue one I'd kept pressed in the closet since my wife passed, the one she always said made my eyes look kind. I smiled, picked up my menu, said nothing. That was 8 months ago. And everything that happened after, every single piece of it, started right there, at table 14 of the Hartwell Grill in Columbus, Ohio, on the night my son let his wife speak to me like that and looked down at his bread plate like he suddenly found it very interesting. My name is not important. People around my neighborhood in Dayton have called me Ray for 58 years, so Ray is fine. I spent 31 years working as a licensed electrician, union job, honest work. I raised my son Daniel alone after his mother Carol died of ovarian cancer when he was 17. I worked double shifts so he could go to Ohio State without loans. I drove 4 hours round trip every parent weekend because I told him I would, and I keep my word. Daniel graduated with a degree in finance, got a good job at an investment firm in Columbus, met a woman named Brianna at some rooftop event 2 years later. Brianna's family had money. Her father owned 3 car dealerships outside of Cincinnati. Her mother organized charity galas and had her nails done twice a week. They were not bad people necessarily. They were just people who had never in their lives needed to know how to change a breaker box or pack a lunch before a 6 a.m. shift. The first time I met Brianna, she shook my hand and asked what I did. When I told her I was an electrician, she smiled with her mouth but not her eyes and said, "Oh, that's so useful," like I was a good set of jumper cables. I didn't hold it against her. People say thoughtless things. I've been guilty of it myself. But it became a pattern. Every holiday dinner, every birthday, every time I was in the same room as Brianna's parents, her father Gerald and her mother Susan, I noticed the way she spoke to me differently than she spoke to them. With them it was warm, easy, laughing. With me it was polite in the way that a hotel front desk is polite. Correct, efficient, and underneath it, just barely, a quiet impatience. Daniel noticed nothing. Or he chose to notice nothing. I was never sure which was worse. When they got engaged, I was genuinely happy. I hugged my son in the parking lot of the restaurant where he told me, and I meant it, I had raised him to be a good man. I believed Brianna could be a good woman. I thought maybe I was reading too much into things. I offered to contribute to the wedding. I'd been saving for years, not for anything specific, just the way my generation saves quietly in a credit union account, because you never know. I had a little over $90,000 set aside. I told Daniel I wanted to give them $20,000 toward the wedding as a gift. No strings, no expectations. He called me back 2 days later and said Brianna thought it would be cleaner if her parents handled the wedding finances since they were more familiar with the vendors and the venues. He said it gently, the way he always delivered bad news, like he was handing me something fragile. I said that was fine. I kept the money where it was. The wedding was beautiful. Brianna was beautiful. The venue was a restored barn outside of Dublin, Ohio, with string lights and a live band and food stations with tiny labels written in calligraphy. It probably cost more than I made in my best year. Gerald gave a toast that made everyone cry. I sat at a table near the back with Daniel's college roommate and 2 of Brianna's cousins who spent most of the reception on their phones. No one asked me to speak. I didn't make a scene. I danced once with a woman named Patty who turned out to be Brianna's aunt, and she was lovely. I ate the salmon. I drove home at 10:30 because I had an early job the next morning, and I am 58 years old, and I need my sleep. About 6 months after the wedding, Daniel called to tell me Brianna was pregnant. I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. I sat in my kitchen in Dayton, and I cried the good kind of tears, the kind that come when something you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for, it finally arrives. A grandchild. Carol would have lost her mind with joy. I drove to Columbus that weekend with a card and a little stuffed elephant Carol's mother had given us when Daniel was born. I'd kept it in a box in the closet. I thought it should go to the next generation. Brianna was polite. She thanked me for the elephant with the hotel desk smile. She put it on the counter, and I noticed later, before I left, that it had been moved to a shelf in the corner of the guest room, turned slightly toward the wall. I told myself I was being too sensitive. Over the next few weeks, Brianna started a social media page called Growing the Hartwell Family. She posted updates about the pregnancy, nursery decoration ideas, registry links. It had a warm, professional feel, like she'd taken a class on personal branding. People loved it. Gerald and Susan shared every post. Then, about 3 weeks after the announcement, Brianna posted something different. She wrote that the pregnancy had come with some unexpected complications. Nothing life-threatening, she said, but the medical bills were adding up and insurance wasn't covering everything. She had created a GoFundMe. The goal was $15,000. She posted a link. I sat with that for a long time. I had raised a child. I knew what pregnancy cost in America. I knew insurance didn't cover everything. I also knew that Brianna's father owned 3 car dealerships and her mother wore jewelry that wasn't purchased at a mall. I knew that my son had a good salary and they had bought a 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus where the average home price was over $400,000. I did not post anything on the GoFundMe. I did not comment on the social media page, but I did start paying closer attention. I called Daniel one evening, casual, just to check in. I asked how Brianna was feeling. He said she was tired but okay. I asked what the specific complications were, just so I could understand. He got a little vague. He said something about hormone levels and specialist visits. I asked which specialist. He said he'd have to check with Brianna. He never called me back about it. I have a friend named Walt. We've been friends since we were both apprentice electricians in 1991. Walt went a different direction after a few years. He became a paralegal, then an investigator, worked for insurance companies for a long time. Now he does private work. Walt is the kind of man who can find out whether a thing is true without ever leaving his office. I took Walt to lunch. I told him what I'd observed. I told him about the GoFundMe, about the vague answers, about the pattern of behavior I'd seen since the beginning. I told him I hoped I was wrong. I told him I would rather be wrong. Walt said he'd look into it. He said it quietly, the way he does everything, and I paid for the lunch and drove home and tried not to think about it for a while. That turned out to be harder than expected. Because 2 days later, Brianna posted again. The complications had worsened, she wrote. She was going to need more support. She updated the GoFundMe goal to $25,000. She thanked everyone who had already donated. Several of Daniel's co-workers had given, friends from college. A woman I recognized as Brianna's former roommate had given $500. Gerald and Susan had each given $1,000. I thought about my son, about the lunch I packed him every day for 11 years, about the winter I worked 60-hour weeks so I could buy him the graphing calculator his teacher said he needed, about the 4-hour round trips. I thought about Carol and what she would say, and I decided to say nothing and wait for Walt. Walt called me on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after our lunch. He had spoken to a contact at the hospital system Brianna had referenced in her posts. Nothing official, just a conversation. He had also run some background on Brianna that was entirely public record. The pregnancy, Walt told me, appeared to be progressing normally. There was no indication in any records he could access of the specialist visits or complications she'd described. The GoFundMe funds, he noted, had already been partially withdrawn, not to a medical provider, but to a personal account. There was something else. Brianna had done this before. 3 years earlier, before she met Daniel, she had run a similar campaign, a different platform, a different story, a different city, a sick relative who needed help with medical costs. Walt had found 2 people who donated and later tried to get refunds when they discovered the relative didn't exist. Neither had pushed it legally. They'd just let it go. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for about 20 minutes after Walt told me this. Then I went inside and I made a plan. I did not call Daniel. Not yet. I knew how that conversation would go. Brianna would deny it, Daniel would be caught in the middle, and I would become the problem. The suspicious father-in-law who never really supported the relationship. I had watched enough of those movies play out in other families. I needed the moment to be right. The graduation dinner had been Brianna's idea, actually. Her idea, in the way that Brianna's ideas often worked. She suggested it sweetly. Daniel relayed it to me as though it were a spontaneous family desire, and I was expected to show up and be grateful for the inclusion. The occasion was a certificate program Brianna had completed in nonprofit management, a 6-month online course. It was a real certificate from a real program, and I have no interest in diminishing anyone's education. But the dinner was at the Hartwell Grill, which runs about $90 a plate, and the guest list included Gerald and Susan and 2 of Brianna's girlfriends and their husbands, and I drove 45 minutes in my truck and wore my best blue shirt. And she looked at my shirt like it was an insult to the room. I mean, it's fine. For a handyman, I guess. Her friend laughed, just barely, the quick kind of laugh you do when you're not sure if something was a joke. Gerald looked at his drink. Susan touched the stem of her wine glass. Daniel looked at his bread plate. I smiled, picked up my menu, said nothing. But I made a decision at that table that I'd been circling for months. I drove home that night, and I called Walt and I told him I was ready to move forward. I wanted everything documented, everything clean. And I wanted to do it in a way that gave Daniel the clearest possible choice. Walt took another 2 weeks. He was thorough. He compiled the original GoFundMe records, the withdrawal history, which is publicly accessible on certain platforms when campaigns cross reporting thresholds, the background information on the prior incident, and statements from one of the 2 original donors who was now willing to put something in writing. He also found something I hadn't expected. The nonprofit management certificate Brianna had earned? The program was accredited, yes, but the final project, the one she'd presented to her cohort and posted about extensively online, was built around a fictional charitable organization she had created for the assignment. She had used real medical statistics, real photos sourced from stock image sites, and a real-sounding name. 3 months after the course ended, that same organization's name appeared in the GoFundMe description. She had essentially used her homework as a blueprint. I sat with the whole file for a weekend, read it twice, walked around my neighborhood, thought about what Carol would say, and then stopped trying to predict it because I realized Carol would have been too angry to be predictable. Then I called Daniel and asked him to meet me for breakfast, just the 2 of us. I told him I had something I wanted to share with him before I decided what to do next. We met at a diner in Dayton, the one we used to go to when he was in high school, the one with the corner booth by the window that we always got because we arrived early, and I taught him that arriving early was how you get the corner booth. He sat down across from me, and he looked tired. He'd been looking tired for a few months, I realized, the kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. I put Walt's folder on the table between us. I didn't say anything dramatic. I didn't make a speech. I just told him, before you open this, I want you to know that I love you and I am not your enemy. I told him I had sat on this information because I wanted to be certain, because the last thing I ever wanted to do was bring him something like this and be wrong. I told him that whatever happened next, I would be in his corner. Then he opened the folder. He read slowly. He turned pages carefully, the way he used to read his textbooks, like he was trying to memorize it as he went. Halfway through, he stopped and looked up at me, and I could see him doing the math, not financial math, but the other kind, the kind where you go back through the last year and a half and recalculate everything you thought was true. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "The GoFundMe. I thought insurance was just—" "I know what you thought," I said. He closed the folder. He put his hands flat on the table. He's got my hands. Daniel does. Broad palms, short fingers, the kind that look like they belong to someone who works with them. Even in his finance job with his pressed shirts, he's still got my hands. "I didn't know," he said. "I believe you," I said. And I did. What happened after that is partly Daniel's story to tell, not mine, and I'll respect that boundary. But I'll tell you what I know. Daniel hired a family law attorney in Columbus, a woman named Patricia, who a colleague of Walt's had recommended. Daniel and Patricia sat down with everything in the folder and went through it carefully. Daniel also, on his own, went back through their joint finances and found 2 other withdrawals he hadn't been able to account for. Not large amounts individually, but together they added up to just over $8,000 across 14 months. Brianna, when confronted, did not deny it. She cried. She said she'd been scared. She said her family had money on paper, but her father's dealerships had struggled the last few years, and she hadn't wanted to ask them for help. She said she'd only meant for it to be temporary. She said a lot of things. Daniel listened. Then he asked her one question. He asked her if she had been pregnant. She was quiet for a moment that I imagine lasted a very long time. Then she said, yes, she had been, briefly. She had miscarried at 6 weeks before most people knew, and she had not told Daniel because she hadn't known how, and by that point, the GoFundMe was already live, and she had already spent part of the money, and she didn't know how to stop it. I don't know what to do with that part. I've thought about it a lot. There's a grief in it that I can't dismiss even now. But there's also a choice she made, and then another choice and another, and at some point, the grief doesn't explain all the choices. Daniel filed for legal separation in November. Brianna returned the GoFundMe funds. Patricia made sure of that. It was structured as a civil matter, not criminal, and the donors were refunded through a formal process. The prior incident Walt had found was disclosed to the relevant parties as part of that process. I was told, secondhand, that Gerald and Susan were not entirely surprised, and that there had been other things before, things within the family that had been quietly managed. I don't say that with any satisfaction. On a Wednesday morning in January, about a week before the new year, Daniel drove to Dayton, and we had breakfast again at the same diner. He got the corner booth because he arrived before me, and I was glad to see he remembered that lesson, even if he beat me to it. He was quieter than usual at first. We ordered, talked about nothing for a while. The weather, whether I needed help with the gutters, a show we'd both been watching. The easy things, the things that mean you're still okay with each other, even when you don't know where to start. Then he put down his fork and he looked at me across the table and he said, "I'm sorry I looked at my bread plate." I knew exactly what he meant. "I know," I said. "She said things about you early on that I should have said something the first time." "Yeah," I said. "You should have." We let that sit there for a minute, the way you have to let true things sit. "I learned it from you, actually," he said. "The staying quiet thing, the waiting." I thought about that for a moment. "The difference is," I said, "I was waiting to do something. You were just waiting for it to stop." He nodded. He knew. We paid the check and walked out to the parking lot, and we stood by our trucks in the January cold, the way we used to stand after high school games, after parent weekends, after every departure that we both knew was temporary. My son is 31 years old. He looks like me, and he's got my hands in his mother's eyes, and somewhere in him, buried under a year and a half of choices he's going to have to live with, is still the kid who used to bring me coffee on Saturday mornings when I was doing paperwork, just because he noticed I hadn't had any yet. He's going to be okay. I believe that. I'm going to be okay too. I drove home on the interstate with the heat turned up and the radio on a country station that played 3 good songs in a row, which is rarer than people think. I thought about Carol and what she would have made of all of it, and I decided she would have been prouder of the breakfast than anything else. Some things you can't fix with a tool. Some things you can only fix by showing up early and taking the corner booth and waiting for the person across from you to be ready to tell the truth. I've been an electrician for 31 years. I know better than most people that the most dangerous problems are the ones you can't see, the ones hiding behind the wall in the wiring no one's looked at in years, carrying a current that has no business being there. You don't fix those with anger. You don't fix them by touching the wrong wire on a bad day. You get your tools, you document everything, and then, when the moment is right, you cut the power. I've been thinking about what actually happened in this story. Not the drama, not the documents, not even the breakfast at the diner. What I keep coming back to is something simpler. The choices people make when they think no one is paying attention. Brianna made a choice the first time she looked at my shirt and decided I wasn't worth her real smile. She made another choice when she built a fundraiser on a foundation of half-truths. And she made another and another, each one slightly easier than the last because no one had stopped her before. That's how it works. Not in some mystical, cosmic sense, just in the plain human sense that behavior without consequence tends to repeat itself and grow. I made choices too. I chose to stay quiet when I should have spoken sooner. I chose to give Daniel the space to figure things out on his own, and for a long time, I told myself that was wisdom. Maybe some of it was, but some of it was also just easier than the conversation I was afraid to have. I've had to sit with that honestly, and I'd encourage anyone in a similar position to do the same. Patience is a virtue, but there's a version of staying silent that isn't patience at all. It's avoidance dressed up in a nicer coat. What changed things wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. There was a moment at that restaurant table after her comment about my shirt where I could feel something sharp rising in my chest. I've felt that before. I know what happens when you let it drive. You say something you can't take back, you become the villain of your own story, and the person who actually caused the problem walks away looking like the victim. I've watched that happen to good men. I refused to let it happen to me. What I chose instead was clarity. I went home, I called Walt, and I started doing what I'd done my whole career. I looked at the wiring, I followed the current to its source, I documented what I found. That's not revenge in the way people usually mean the word. That's just responsibility. If something is wrong, you don't yell at the wall. You find the fault and you fix it properly. The hardest part was Daniel. Not confronting Brianna, not the legal process, not any of it. The hardest part was sitting across from my son and watching him read that folder and seeing the exact moment his understanding of the last 18 months rearranged itself. That look on his face is something I'll carry for a long time. But I also know that real love sometimes means handing someone the truth, even when it's heavy, even when they didn't ask for it, even when part of you wishes you could protect them from it instead. He's going to be okay. He knows how to work hard and how to show up. I raised him on those two things, and whatever else went wrong, those held. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's that integrity isn't just about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do in the long, quiet months when no one knows what you know and you could easily do nothing. The man who stays honest when it costs him something. That's the man worth listening to. And the person who builds their life on deception finds eventually that there's no solid floor under it. I'm 58 years old. I've got my health, my tools, my corner booth, and my son. That's enough. That has always been enough. Some people spend their whole lives trying to acquire what I already have, and the tragedy is they're usually trying to acquire it from someone else.